Dr. Lim Kibwa, the Chief Executive Officer of Penang Institute, Tim Nicholas, Chief Operating Officer of Penang Institute, Dr. Moro Verde, Economist in the World Bank, Harry Moros, Economist in the World Bank, Mr. K. Sudharan Stanley from the Migration Working Group in Malaysia, Mr. Kway Tiam Hock, Partner in Audit at the VDO of Penang. Members of the today's forum, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you. First, let me thank the Penang Institute for actually organizing this very important forum this morning with the participation of World Bank economists who have come from Kuala Lumpur to Penang, and we wish in future more World Bank personnel can come to Penang. Don't forget that Penang is part of Malaysia. I think this is a very, I wouldn't say familiar, because I did my research on labor. That's when I was at the National University some years back. And I wrote, my area of specialty was political economy of labor. And but I don't pretend to be an academic now. I don't know really what goes on in the academic world. But this subject of migrant labor is something that I have written about it, spoke about it, at least in the past, not so much in the future. But then, since now suddenly, bringing 1.5 million Bangladeshi workers to Malaysia, there is serious concerns in this country. And these serious concerns have not been allayed by the politicians of the ruling coalition. In fact, they have made the situation worse. In fact, there are already, I would ask, 30% of the Malaysian workforce are foreign workers, both legal, both documented and undocumented. Maybe it's more. I wouldn't know because we don't get the right statistics. And the federal government and the Ministry of Human Resources is pretty reticent on the issue of foreign labor. We have the Minister of Human Resources, Richard Riot, who is hardly on the scene. He disappears into the, I suppose, the outback of Sarawak. He has hardly made any comment on this very important issue of migrant labor, except to announce that Malaysia has inked a deal with the Bangladeshi government in bringing about 1.5 million Bangladeshi workers. Of course, he added a caveat saying that not all the 1.5 million workers are coming into Malaysia. These are actually registered Bangladeshi workers. Whereas the Deputy Minister, the Minister of Home Affairs, Zaid Hamidi says, yes, 1.5 million, we are going to bring in, we are going to bring them in soon. And after some hue and cry, the deal has been suspended. The deal has not been rescinded, but has been suspended. And I think this has raised more concerns in Malaysia, especially among groups who want more transparency and accountability on the part of the federal government. Now, we are not against, let me assure those who are here, we are not against migrant labor. This country was built on migrant labor. This was when thousands of Indians and Chinese, to some extent Japanese, who brought into the country during the British colonial period. There is nothing unique to Malaysia. In fact, many countries were built on migrant labor. But what's the problematic is you are bringing in migrant labor when Malaysians are actually facing there's a huge labor shortage in this. I mean, huge demand for employment. So in other words, you're bringing in migrant labor and also displacing for local workers. The whole argument of the Deputy Home Minister, Zaid Hamidi, who has been rather vocal on the issue of the migrant labor, we are bringing in the 1.5, he says, well-behaved, docile, Bangladeshi workers, because Malaysians are not interested to work in the 3D sector. 3Ds, that is dirty, dangerous and Dirty, dangerous, what else? Difficult. Now, I'm not sure whether he's actually talking about the public sector or whether he's talking about the private sector. And I hear, actually, the bulk of the 1.5 million workers are meant for the industries in Malaysia, especially in electronic industries. It's nothing to do with the 3D employment. Because, see, I sit as the chairman of the employment committee in Penang. Every 3 months, we meet in terms of intake in the local councils. I'm also the chairman of the recruitment committee at the PDC and PBA, and thousands of Malaysians apply for a low-skill job. Literally, thousands of Malaysians apply for a low-skill job. And we have difficulty actually employing all these Malaysian workers. Whether you talk about PDC, I can only talk about the state agencies, whether you talk about the two local government, local councils, both on the island and in Penang, thousands apply. These are not Bangladeshis, these are not Nepalese, these are not Myanmaris, these are local Malaysian workers. Now, I'm not very sure what the minister means by 3D. Is he referring to public sector employment, or is he referring to employment in the industries? I'm not very sure. So if he says 3D employment, then obviously he's lying. He's not telling the truth. Because there is no 3D employment in the factories. So I hear, we have asked for the list of the employers who actually demand foreign labor. In fact, there have been many requests. Come out with a list. Who are these employers who want foreign labor? And what is the real necessity? Is there a necessity? Because I think, yes, we are not against foreign labor, we are not against migrant labor, but it has to be regulated, it has to be managed. Right. Where they do not come and displace workers. In fact, I'm getting complaints, I've been getting complaints the last 8 years. Some of the employers in Penang are not willing to hire local workers. Preference is given to the Myanmaris, preference is given to Vietnamese workers, preference is given to Rohingyas, preference is given to the Bangladeshis, whether they are documented or undocumented, better if they are not documented. Because this goes back to the whole idea of Marx's idea of primitive accumulation. You can squeeze them. And invariably, the harder you squeeze, the more profit you can make. You can alter the working. This is what I call it variable capital. You can alter how labor functions. They are given really low salaries. They are amenable. It's not like opening a tap. You can open it and shut it whenever you like. Now, again, so this is the question that I think Malaysians want to know. We have serious unemployment issues in the country. Local can't get jobs. Even referring to the low-skill 3D employment. Now, who is it? Okay. Furthermore, it's not just a question of supply and demand, as some great politicians want to make it out to be. It's more than simply the case of supply and demand. We are looking at the intervening variables. Who is behind the recruitment? What is the relationship between the recruitment and so-called companies that are aligned to UMNO and Barisan Nasional? These are crony companies. And I hear one politician or a relative of a politician has 100 companies. To me, I have nothing to hide. I'm just saying very openly here. Migration, the bringing of foreign workers in this country is a disaster. Now I'm asking, who are the companies behind it? It's just not because there's a demand, the laborers come in. Who are the agents in Bangladesh? Who are the agents in Malaysia? Are the politicians involved? Because this is big money. This is big money. How much does the ruling party get from this recruitment? No, these are things that I think we need to be very, very open and transparent about. Who are the agents in Bangladesh? Now, these are the answers we are looking for. Sorry, it simply is not supply and demand. Maybe I would even think it's an artificial demand created by the collusion between state agencies, employers, and recruiters. Why can't you employ local labor? It's not that local labor is not interested, but you have to pay decent wages. If I'm not mistaken, recently there was a study by the U.S. State Department, and I can't remember the details of the study, whether the American companies are actually following certain labor standards. In fact, it was found out most of them not even following the labor standards, let alone companies run by other nationals. So I think in Penang, there was an attempt to bring in the Rohingyas, because the Myanmarese government has declared the Rohingyas are not the citizens. Whether we agree with that or not, that's a different matter. They wanted to bring Rohingyas. And we in Penang, we said, we are not against Rohingyas. We are not against the placement of Rohingyas or any other immigrants, because we have a very bad refugee policy in this country. We don't even recognize people as refugees. The UNHCR simply gives them a card. They can move about. They are not even allowed to have a job. They can't even send their children to schools. We said, no, if you want to bring in Rohingyas to the Penang, let's talk with the Penang government. And then some said, of course, why are you bringing in the Rohingyas in anticipation of the next general elections? Because there are already rumors. You bring in large number of foreign workers, and especially if they are Malay Muslims, it's a reservoir of voters. I'm just raising these speculations. And people are concerned, they may not be true, but Malaysians are concerned about all these things. The Penangites are concerned, and I am concerned. I am reflecting the concerns of the Penangites, those who voted for me in the last election. Are they the reserve voters for the next election? UMNO is in doldrums. The Barisan National is in doldrums. So this is a serious issue of foreign workers. Yeah? We are not, somebody said, xenophobic. We are not xenophobic. But why do you bring in these people? Countries like Indonesia, at least they are now planning to regulate. You just can't take the Indonesian workers for right. Indonesia will protest. India might do that. Myanmar, no. Bangladesh, no. You can do whatever you want with the workers. The Bangladesh government just wants to export its problems overseas. So when the host government is not interested, then you can expect the worst kind of employment policies in this country. I know workers work about 15 to 16 hours, no rest. You know, workers are beaten to death. This happens not just in Kuala Lumpur, this happens in Penang. Maybe economists, you should just come down to me, ivory tower, and look at these real situations where workers are beaten. If they protest, they're beaten. If they ask for wages, they're beaten. This is not the kind of labor conditions we expect in the 21st century when we are talking about something like democracy, liberalization, the rights of people, rights of workers, rights of human beings, human rights. And how do you expect Malaysia to move in the direction of attaining a developed status if a segment of the population, especially foreign workers, are treated in a manner that is highly undesirable? I'm not even talking about local workers. We have only about 9% or 10% of the local workers are organized in trade unions. Many of the multinationals are so afraid of trade unions. Yet in the host country, in their country, they allow for trade unions. But when they come here, they don't allow for trade unions. Why? Why this discrepancy? Yeah? Why this double standard? 10%, 9% of the workers are organized. Yeah? And this is declining. There's a relative decline. Once upon a time you had national unions. Now you have company unions. Yeah? Or you call it in-house unions. How many of the workers are organized? In fact, you can't even organize, especially in free trade zones. This is some promise made by the Malaysian government attracting foreign capital. But then, at that time, it's understandable. But now, we are talking about 60 years of political independence. Can you allow for this? So, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to sound very pessimistic. I feel that certain things has to be told. And it has to be told in a manner without hiding anything. I mean, we can all get into the whole idea of supply and demand, come out with the economic model, econometric models, understanding labor. But let's not reify these things. We are dealing with real human beings. Real human beings who are subjected to this kind of abuse and treatment. So I challenge Zahid Hamidi, come out with a deal. What is the MOU between the Bangladeshi government and the Malaysian government? I asked the Minister of Human Resources, Richard Wright, come out with this deal. We like to know. You presented it in Parliament. Why is there so much secrecy around these labor deals? This is my question. And we are very, very disappointed. Very disappointed because out of misery of these people, there are a few who are making the millions. It's a fact, everyone knows about it. It has become an axiom. Out of the misery and the depredation of these workers, there are a few who are making millions out of what I would call it blood sacrifice. And this is Malaysia. A country, a so-called country heading towards a developed status. You forget about it in a developed status. A country that has so much promise. A country that gave so much hope to Malaysians in the 60s and 70s and maybe even 80s. And today there's a major reversal. Who are we to blame? A teacher makes a racist remark in a school in Penang. What is the punishment? Gets transferred and gets promoted. This is Penang Free School. So much about the Penang Free School. Makes a racist statement against a group of students, and then the headmaster, and then he is transferred, and subsequently he'll be promoted. This has been the case. There's so much racism. There's so much religious bigotry in this country. Everything is seen through the racial and racial and religious. If you are a non-Muslim, you are a secondary citizen in this country. I mean, Malaysia is not the only country. There are others I can point out. And these foreign workers stand no chance at all against what is happening in Malaysia. I'm not talking about just Bangladeshi workers. I'm talking about any workers anywhere. There is a pitiful state. I hear these Indian workers working in restaurant coming and complaining to me. In fact, I wrote to the High Commissioner and I spoke to the Indian High Commissioner. Is this what India is practicing? Anyway, lucky he took action. He made an announcement that he will withdraw the special passport of all Indian restaurant owners if they continue to exploit labor, if they continue to subject labor to the most inhuman condition. And these are people who have, sold their land, borrowed money to come to El Dorado, So where is the El Dorado? So anyway, sorry, I didn't read your speech as usual, and you prepared. So I think we have our friends from the World Bank. I think you have to go beyond what is the official version, because the non-official version, I think, perhaps is much more accurate, much more, what do you call it, real, because at the end of the day, we are not talking about dollars and cents, we are talking about the lives of human beings, the freedom of human beings, the lives of ordinary workers. And today Malaysia has all these infrastructures, is because of the toil and the sweat of these people who have been forgotten in this country. I come from a working class background. In fact, many of us come from working class background. And yet, the idea of this whole foreign labor is presented and sort of put in a framework in such a manner that we, without realizing, have views bordering on xenophobia against foreign workers. When we realize the real culprits are those in agencies, in the ministries, in the political parties, who are taking all of us for a long, long ride. So eventually, the enemy is not those, the real culprits, become the foreign workers. I think, having said that, I think I will, I think the Penang Institute, I really congratulate the Penang Institute, especially Lim, then what do you call it, Tim, who are actually organizing the seminar. In fact, I felt that this should be a priority, and to give our, at least Penangites, a perspective on the issue of migrant labor. And I think if Malaysians realize, we put emphasis that the local workers should be employed, the conditions must be set, primacy must be placed on local workers. Most governments do. Governments of the United States, Japan, they do it, on for. But here is a reverse. Here is a reverse. When a minister, a federal minister, a deputy prime minister, justifying, he says the local workers are lazy. I don't think Obama will have the guts to say that. I don't think the British Prime Minister will have the guts to say that, even if he thinks it's true. But it's here. It's an insult to the Malaysians to say Malaysians are lazy and they don't prefer the 3D jobs. So having said that, thank you for inviting me for this forum, and I wish the participants will be looking forward for the presentation of the World Bank. Maybe Dr. Lim can give me the report later. Take a look at it. And we will continue to organize Penang Institute without fear or favor on the major issues, on economic issues, on social issues, on cultural issues that actually are the concerns of Malaysians, and at least Malaysians can see for themselves what is really wrong in this country. With that I say thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Minister. Now I would like to invite the economists from World Bank, Dr. Tessabert and Mr. Moros, to start off today's event with a presentation on this issue. Please.
For inviting us. It's a very great opportunity to be here for us to talk about a topic which is so important and so relevant as anticipated by Deputy Chief Minister in his introduction. So it's so important for us to have this opportunity to speak about migration, which is a topic that the World Bank is discussing more and more lately. And just to give you an idea of why this topic is so important, lately we've created a growing group, community of practice talking about migration issues. So here, as anticipated, being this a topic which is very controversial, we had to decide as an international institution of how to look at these issues, what stand to take. And the approach we've been taking has been one of trying to inform the discussion based on economic evidence. I also tried to take the international experience and the best practice to inform the dialogue. So this engagement with the government of Malaysia has been lasting for a few years now. The Malaysian Economic Monitor has been launched in December 2015, but this reflects work of a very large team based in different parts of the world, some in Malaysia, some in DC, some other parts of the world, and discussing the topic of economic migration. So it's what we tried to do was to collect all the information, the hard evidence from data, and this data, as my colleague will explain later, it comes from various sources, both administrative and labor force data, and also talk with different stakeholders and bring in the international evidence. So what the report, which is very long, is the part of migration is around 50 pages, covers different areas. So first of all, the point we want to make is that migration in Malaysia is related to economic development. So there are some economic reasons behind migration. So Malaysia has been growing very fast over the last years. As we know, there's been a phenomenon of poverty eradication. Now poverty in Malaysia is almost non-existent. And this has attracted foreign labor for other neighboring countries, less developed, economically developed neighboring countries. And the presence of foreign labor has also contributed to Malaysian economic development. I will try to show some facts to support this hypothesis. The second part is really about who are the foreign workers in Malaysia, because it's important to understand more about the phenomenon to then understand the impacts. And here, the debate in Malaysia, as well as in other countries, is about cost and benefits related to migration. And what we're trying to do is to highlight both, and being very honest in say that there are some areas in which more research is needed. There are some areas in which we can confidently suggest some conclusions. In others, we don't know enough evidence. And then once there is an idea of the cost and benefits, what we really want to try to do is to go back to the Malaysian system, looking at different policies, the evolution of the system, the institutions in place, and based on international experience, try to identify some areas for improvement. And finally, we have a long list of policy recommendations, and I hope the report can be distributed to all of you soon. I'm going to touch upon that, and then in the Q&A, I believe we'll have the opportunity to go in more details on all of that. So now what we would like to do is to first present the economic evidence, and my colleague Aaron Morales will present that, and then go back to the policy and the system and discuss a bit about the current situation in Malaysia.
Thank you, Dr. Tessaver. Now I would like to invite Mr. Moros to continue on the presentation.
Thank you. So as Maro was mentioning, I want to kind of set the stage a little bit and talk briefly about the Contribution to immigrant labor to Malaysia's development in recent history. Malaysia has had a relatively open immigration policy, and that's really helped investors in the country to benefit from the country's relatively good infrastructure and its quite good business environment, while also having access to lower cost labor. Indeed, migrants have allowed manufacturing to remain relatively competitive, even as the commodity boom has put pressure on real effective exchange rates. And really notably, the education levels of local Malaysians have increased significantly over the last 20 years, which has had significant benefits for the economy. I'm going to come back to the next point a little later in the presentation, but recent economic modeling suggests that a 10% net increase in low-skilled immigrant workers to Malaysia increases GDP in the country by 1.1%. So there are several potential channels for that effect to work. Those are employment, wages, fiscal impacts, as well as technological change. That evidence isn't unique to Malaysia. We actually see that in other countries in the region. So there's similar evidence for Thailand and for Singapore. And again, I'll come back and we'll talk a bit more about the potential channels that explain why we would see that type of impact. So first, what we found looking at the evidence is that immigration to Malaysia, as to many other countries globally, is a structural phenomenon. Particularly within the region, Malaysia is a high performer with respect to several other countries, particularly Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, which are the main sending countries. We also see large disparities in wages between those sending countries and Malaysia. Migrants from those main sending countries see a significant benefit from migrating to Malaysia. They can expect higher wages than they would be able to earn in their host countries. An additional phenomenon that's becoming an important factor in East Asia is population aging. This is less of a factor in Malaysia. Malaysia's population is relatively young compared to other places like Thailand, for instance, and certainly to Singapore. But the surplus of labor in younger countries, in Indonesia, and countries like that, ends up driving migrants to places like Malaysia, where as populations age, the working age population shrinks a little bit, and there's a higher demand for labor. I want to emphasize a little bit the data sources we've used to make some of our assessments about immigration in Malaysia. So we rely on kind of two primary sources. We rely on the labor force survey that the Department of Statistics conducts, and we also rely on some administrative data.
Sorry, I have another function.
Sure.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So based on the labor force data, we see that foreign workers make up about 13% of Malaysia's labor force. That is a significant number and fairly high among other countries in the region. That number captures both documented and undocumented immigrants. We see from administrative data that there are likely 2.1 million registered migrants and likely more than 1 million undocumented migrants in total. That's based on administrative data coming from the 6P regularization group. Again, there's some uncertainty about the undocumented immigrant number, but we think that's a relatively good estimate. Now you can see that since 2001, the foreign worker share of the labor force has remained relatively constant. Prior to 2001, between 1990 and the early 2000s, the labor force share of foreign workers actually increased quite significantly, from around 3 or 4% to today's current 13%. The next slide, please. One important characteristic of immigration to Malaysia is that it's primarily economic. So we base that assessment on a couple of things. One is that we see most migrants in Malaysia participating in the labor force. So you can see that for male immigrants, there's an extremely high labor force participation rate that's higher than 90%. And then again, for female immigrants, it's higher than for female locals at around 60% or so. The Malaysian labor market in general is quite tight. Unemployment rates in general are low. You see that for both local workers and for immigrants. The next slide. One other significant phenomenon to note with respect to Malaysia's development over the last 20 years or so is that the education levels of locals have increased significantly. Currently, most Malaysians have secondary or post-secondary education. That's particularly important in the context of migration because you don't see a similar phenomenon amongst foreign workers in Malaysia. In fact, in 2001, foreign workers had low levels of education in general, and that has not changed very significantly since 2001. Next slide. We also see that immigrant workers are concentrated in a certain type of occupation. So immigrant workers tend to be concentrated in low-skilled jobs, that is, in elementary occupations. And their rates of, their share within those occupations is highest in the low-skilled occupations. So we see that foreign workers' share of low-skilled work, that is elementary occupations, is almost 50%. Okay. The final phenomenon to highlight, or characteristic to highlight about foreign workers in Malaysia is that local workers actually earn a premium to foreign workers. That is to say that controlling for characteristics like age, education, and work experience, local workers earn more than their immigrant counterparts. The exception to that is workers in the highest skilled occupations. That's a phenomenon we see around the world where the most skilled workers who are immigrants actually earn more than local workers do. So I said that we were going to return to the impact of immigration on Malaysia's economic development. So again, we highlight this finding from economic modeling that a 10% increase in low-skilled immigrant workers increases GDP in Malaysia by 1.1%. So again, we have these potential channels of employment, wages, fiscal effects, and technological change. So now we'll delve into each of those individually. In the Malaysia Economic Monitor, we updated some previous work we had done looking at the impact of foreign workers in Malaysia on several dimensions, on the employment of Malaysians and on the wages of Malaysians. So the figure on the slide shows the results of the updated results that we have come up with for the impact of immigration to Malaysia on the employment of Malaysians, of native workers. So we can see that we estimate that 10 new immigrants to a state and to a sector lead to 5.2 jobs for Malaysians in that state and sector. In contrast, we see basically no effects on unemployment and on Malaysians who are out of the labor force. So contrary to the common idea that immigrants actually lead to declines in employment among native workers, we find that the presence of new immigrants in a state and in a sector leads to employment increases. Now, despite this overall impact, there are differential impacts on different groups of people. The impact of new migrants to a state and sector is concentrated among young Malaysians and among better educated Malaysians as well. So lesser skilled, lesser educated Malaysians don't see this positive impact from immigration. Now to the impacts on wages. Again, a commonly held belief is that immigration ends up leading to declines in wages of local workers. Internationally, in fact, you see that these impacts are very small. So sometimes you find negative impacts, sometimes you find positive impacts, but they generally are clustered around zero. So what we found in Malaysia is that overall there's a slight decline in wages from migration, but that negative impact is actually a result of a very large impact on immigrant workers themselves. So what that means is that immigration leads to declines in the wages of immigrant workers, of existing immigrant workers, while in fact it has positive, though very small, impacts on local workers. The figure on the right shows a differential impact. So now we look at the impact of immigration on the wages of Malaysian workers by education level. So now you do see, in fact, a negative impact on Malaysian workers with no formal or just primary education. So those are generally workers that we expect to be less skilled. One important thing to note is that that group makes up around 14% of the Malaysian workforce right now. So although we see a negative impact, it's not very large, and it's impacting a group that is currently small, and it's shrinking. So we showed the figure before of current education levels of Malaysian workers, and how those have generally increased, and now the majority of Malaysians have a much higher level of education than just primary schooling. So what's the motivation behind these results? What is driving the results? So in fact, we see that what happens is that immigration reduces production costs, and that's primarily by reducing the wages of immigrant workers. The result of that is expansions in output by individual firms employing foreign workers. And in fact, when output expands, that leads firms to increase their employment of Malaysian workers. Next slide. So one final important impact that's important in Malaysia and discussed in lots of other places as well is what is the fiscal cost of immigration to Malaysia. Now, there hasn't been much research into the issue in Malaysia, but evidence from research around the world, and in particular from the OECD, finds again that there's a relatively small effect of immigration on the fiscal position of a country. So those effects are around negative 0.3% of GDP. Now, our research suggests that those low fiscal costs are probably applicable to Malaysia as well. We think that because fiscal costs tend to be lower when the foreign workforce is younger, that is, younger workers tend to be healthier, tend to use services less, and also the fiscal costs tend to be lower when immigrant populations work more, so when they have higher labor force participation rates. So we saw in a previous slide that labor force participation rates among foreign workers in Malaysia are very high, and in fact most of those people are employed. Additionally, the foreign worker levy, the fact that foreign workers pay consumption taxes, and additionally the health insurance requirement that is now mandatory for employers to provide health insurance cover to foreign workers mean that again the fiscal impact is moderated. There's a concern that undocumented immigrants have a significant fiscal impact, and that's definitely a concern. For undocumented immigrants are not subject to levies, and additionally they're not subject to the health insurance requirement. However, undocumented immigrants still do contribute to the country's fiscal position in a positive way, in several positive ways, two of which are through consumption taxes, because foreign workers do consume in Malaysia, and also indirectly by contributing to growth through higher employment and that expansion in output that we discussed earlier. And now Mauro's going to talk more about the policy issues related to immigration.
So far what we've focused more on has been the discussion on the impact of migration. And as I was saying, it's important to know this to inform the potential policy intervention. So in general, what is important to keep in mind is that the impacts of migration are also a function of the different policies in place. And what we really learned looking at the experience of other countries is that migration policy matter in maximizing the benefit from migration and reducing the cost. So in general, when we talk, something that we believe is important is to clarify what we mean by migration system. So migration systems are migration system are a group of different parts of the system. So we have the admission of migrants, the entry, the stay, the permanence of migrants in the country, also the exit. So there are different phases in the migration process. But also migration policies have to do with sending countries. So not only Malaysia, but also the sending countries. The employers that want to employ foreign workers in Malaysia. The labor force that, as I already showed, also is impacted by the presence of migrants. And the migrants themselves. So we have a whole system with different phases of the migration process, and we have different players. So the main point is, when we talk about migration policies, is to think also about the different incentives of the different players. Sometimes the discussion is a lot about the enforcement of the existing rules or the punishment related to the migration deficiencies. But the main point is also to think about the different incentives of the different players. So what we have done, keeping this in mind, was to look at do a comprehensive analysis of the Malaysian migration system. And so this is a work that we've been conducting since 2011. So we have been looking at the system, we have been talking with stakeholders, we have looking at the law, so we have local international colleagues working on this. And we came with some main conclusion and preliminary assessment. So first of all, what we see is that the migration system in Malaysia is quite fragmented. So there are a lot of different players. So we have the Ministry of Home Affairs, we have the Ministry of Human Resources, we have the Ministry of Health involved in this process as well. We have the Cabinet Committee for Foreign Workers and Legal Migrants, and a lot of different agencies. In total, we counted more than 10 different agencies. And sometimes the mandates of these agencies are overlapping. So this, when a system is so fragmented, usually we see some problems. And then in the part of the policy recommendation, I'm going to discuss a bit about other systems and potential ways to fix these problems. The second part that was discussed at the beginning was related to MOUs and bilateral labor agreements. And here, what is important to keep in mind is that there have been some steps towards improvement of the migration system. So understanding that signing MOUs with sending countries has been a step towards improvement of the migration system. At the same time, some part that we believe has been missing has been relating these bilateral labor agreements to demand in the labor market, and also to involving the key stakeholders in this process. So, as I was mentioning at the beginning, there are different players involved in the process, sending countries, receiving countries, but there are also employers in the receiving countries. When there is a bit of a disconnect between what employers need and what the bilateral labor agreements apply, we see the potential space for undocumented immigration. The next point is related to the admission of foreign workers. And again, let's keep in mind that the migration system has a whole of different parts, and the admission is also a very important part. So what instruments are used in Malaysia for admission of foreign workers? So here we see that the main instruments are quotas, so quantitative restriction, but also levies, so price restrictions. And again, we see that in setting the quotas and setting the levies, there is not much feedback from or input from the labor market to setting the level of both quotas and levies. The next point is related also to the admission and entry of foreign workers, and is how different groups of foreign workers and expats are classified. So what we see in Malaysia is that the cutoffs are purely based on wage consideration. So if foreign workers earns 2,500 ringgit, will be classified as middle-skilled workers, so with an employment pass, while if it earns less than that, 2,400 will be a foreign workers or low-skilled workers. And the rules about that rule, the different passes are completely different. So for some passes, foreign workers can stay in the country for a certain duration. For others, they can stay for shorter, and for others, the pass can be renewed. So, of course, what happens is that employers, being aware of these different thresholds, sometimes they play around the salary of the foreign workers in order to be able to be entitled to different rules, immigration regimes with the foreign workers. Another important point, and one that has focused on a lot of discussion in Malaysia and in other countries as well, is related to the role of third-party intermediaries. So there's been a movement towards bilateral labor agreements, but a lot of the migration management still relies on third-party agencies. What does this mean? This means that a lot of migrants are sourced by private agencies, and these agencies impose, unfortunately, a lot of additional costs for migrants. So there are some rules, there are some caps on the costs that can be imposed on the monthly salary of migrants. This is around 15%. But what happens is that there are private agencies at destination, so in Malaysia, but also in sending countries. While there is a control of the private agencies in Malaysia, it's not as easy to control the private agencies in sending countries. So what happens is that foreign workers pay their usual costs, so the costs associated with the visa application, the health insurance, but also they need to pay some fees related to the agencies in the sending countries. So thinking again about the big picture, the different phases of the migration process and the different players, when the costs are very high for migrant workers, what happens is that they need to stay longer in Malaysia to make up for all the money they paid at the beginning, so this leads to undocumented migration. And finally, one of the other points we notice is that since the system is very fragmented, coordination on enforcement is very hard. And I will be clear here in the following way. So we have all everything that is related to the immigration law is under the Ministry of Home Affairs, while the labor regulation is under the Ministry of Human Resources. So in general, according to international standards, the number of inspectors to control all these large workforce of migrant workers would be way higher. So what we see is that there is a very small number of inspectors in the Ministry of Human Resources especially, and there are no joint efforts between the two ministries. So what happens is that the Ministry of Human Resources will do its enforcement, the Ministry of Home Affairs will do its enforcement, but there are no joint missions on that, which limit the effectiveness of this. And as a result, what we see is that, and as Harvey mentioned at the beginning, the number of documented workers is very high in Malaysia. Incentives behind the migration decision, not only on the final part when the migrants become illegal, is very important, and is something that we learn from other experiences. So now, how to move on? So first of all, something to recognize is that in the 11th Malaysian Plan, there is the recognition of the fact that migration, management of foreign workers needs to be better managed. And there are some proposals, there are some of which are in line with what we see in other countries, some a bit less, that we think of 6 main areas, and in the report there are some specific actions for each of them, and we're happy to discuss the specificity of these actions with the Q&A. But just to give you an idea, so you can see that there are 7 main actions and policy priorities. So the first is about the big picture. So in countries in which with very effective migration management systems, migration is not a matter of social security is not a matter of enforcement. It's not seen as a threat of the unity of the nation. Rather, this country like Australia and the UK realize that migration can contribute to the economy. And for this reason, migration policies is pretty much aligned to human resources development strategy of the country. What does this mean? This means that there is a more expanded role for the Ministry of Labour in these countries. Related to this point is the role of the labour market information. So realizing that migration can contribute and that can have a positive impact on the labour market, how can the information on the labour market, but in general on the world economy, can be used to better manage migration? And here we see some clear examples in which this is done. So the case of Australia, the example of the UK are again best practices in this respect. And there are examples in which there is a combination of data analysis, but also, as mentioned at the beginning, data can only go up to a point. After that, it's important to have consultations with the key stakeholders. So combining a data approach with consultation with stakeholders can lead to the creation of a platform that can serve to the tech skill shortages. And this is something that is very useful, can be used as a unique point of reference for the different policies related to migration and economy. The third point is related to how to regulate management and admission. So as I said earlier, in Malaysia it's a combination of quotas, so quantity restriction, and levies, so price restrictions. Now, what do we see in other countries? In general, we see a movement from quantity restriction to more price-based restrictions. And Singapore is a very good example in which the levies are used in a very proactive way and updated based on the labour market information, but also on the objective of the country. So for example, if looking at the productivity of different sectors, the levies can be adjusted. And again, this is not something that is done once and then it gets parked there, because it's very important to try to get the signal from the labour market and update the instruments accordingly. The fourth point is related to the criteria for admission. And so moving away from wages threshold to a more comprehensive assessment. And again, since wages are really easy to manipulate, what is important is to have a holistic approach. What does this mean? This means looking at a comprehensive list of skills and the requirement to be in some occupations. And the main, what becomes obvious looking at the different countries is that if you accept migrants with certain skills, then even if the migrants don't work in the specific job, they can be employed in other jobs and skills that are needed in the economy. So moving from a very static approach and very restrictive approach based on wages threshold to a more comprehensive approach is something that is proven to be working in other countries. The fifth point is really much related to the enforcement. And here we recognize that governments work on budget constraints, so it's not so easy to scale up the number of people working on enforcement, both in the Ministry of Human Resources and the Ministry of Home Affairs. But what we have been seeing in Malaysia working here for different years is that the technology base is very wide. The Malaysian government in general, Malaysia technology is very advanced. So using technology to help with enforcement would be very important. And just to give you a couple of examples, realizing that it would be impossible to monitor all the sites at all times, something that could be done is to have some type of risk assessment to identify the sectors and the location in which there is more likelihood to have some infractions and try to go there more often. Something else that can be done that is very much related also to the implementation point is to have the different databases owned by different ministries to communicate with each other. At the moment, we see that there are very sophisticated type of information collected. Also, there is the possibility to know a lot about the foreign workers, to identify them very specifically, but these different data sets, the databases are are owned by different ministries that don't share this type of information. When in a context in which there are some resource constraints for monitoring, having the system to communicate to each other would be very important. And the last 2 points are really much related to how to use the revenues from the levies. So one advantage of the levies as opposed to quotas is that since employers pay levies, this is part of the revenues for a country. So since we saw that undocumented migration is pretty large, but there are large, more than 1 million workers, almost 2 million workers are documented, using the levies collected to try to compensate the losers for migration would be important. And this can be done in 2 ways. So we saw that the impact of migration is, there are positive impacts, but there are also negative impacts for specific groups of the population. And these are the Malaysian, they are the less skilled. So using the levies for training programs for the lower skilled workers can help compensate for the negative impact that may experience. Something that has been discussed currently during our meetings on the impact of migration is the potential negative impact on technological upgrade. Now, as we mentioned, we don't have enough evidence to show that there is a positive or negative impact, but if this is a concern for the government, since there are a large amount of revenues collected from levies, something that could be done is to use the levies to try to release some constraint on the adoption of technology for certain firms. So in a way, we will move from a system in which there is a passive control of migration to an active control of migration with instruments that are very much related to the labor market. And this is pretty much all it will be.
Tian Hock, audit partner from BDO Penang, who is very experienced in analyzing human resource management in Malaysian firms. Furthermore, we have Mr. Mauro Tesselberg from World Bank. He's a specialist in social protection and labor. And Mr. Moros also from World Bank. Now I would like to pass the floor over to our moderator, Dr. Lim Kim Hwa, to host the forum. The stage is all yours. Dr. Lim, please.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jia. We'll try to kick off the discussion amongst the panelists, and then after that we will open the floor for Q&A. So I think let me just get the ball rolling with my first question. In your report, the suggestion is that Malaysia should ring-fence the levy and then dedicate the money from the levies towards training of Malaysians, whether it's low skill or to elevate the skill level as well as improve productivity. As you also know that indeed the World Bank has done a big report on the issue of brain drain from Malaysia. So how does that increase in levy tie up with the issue of continuous draining of Malaysian talents from Malaysia, and how can that be translated to training of local skills, local Malaysian workers? Who would like to?
Yeah. Okay, that's a very good point, and one that we have been discussing quite a bit. In particular, we've been engaged for the last years with the corporation and trying to understand a bit the effectiveness of their programs. So I would say that it's very hard to stop workers from emigrating. So in general, it's some countries have thought about this potential measure to stop immigration, but in a way, it's hard to do. And also, I don't know whether there is really the space to do that without any limitation of the middle strike. So that's one of the issues. But the next point is really whether it's possible to leverage from the talented people that go abroad and still having positive impact from that. And I'll be clear on this. So people that emigrate are not completely disconnected from their own economy. There are some different channels through which they are still in touch. Some of them are remittances, some are investment, some of knowledge transfer. So trying to leverage on this potential contribution can be, to me, one of more effective measures to have a positive impact on the economy. Some measures that have been discussed in different countries, like taxing remittances or limiting the movement of workers, have ended up not being adopted because it's the way out. So I would say that my view would be to focus more on the potential positive impact on immigration and leveraging on the fact that these people are abroad and can still contribute to the national economy.
All right, thank you. Do you actually see that happening on the ground? Perhaps Mr. Quay would be able to jump in and see whether, from a business perspective, the immigration of whether these local talents and whether they subsequently come back in terms of feedback, in terms of the technological inputs, or whether they come back in terms of the capital investment into the country or remittances that they send back to Malaysia, and hence enhance the capacity of local businesses to operate on a larger scale. Wait, would you be able to add on the business perspective?
Basically, basically, in order to attract the workers to come back to Malaysia or to minimize the great trade issues, basically you need a very successful pull factor, being technology advancement and also expansion, attracting more investments and all this. Somehow, because informations basically flow very widely in the world through internet, so basically the mobility of workers are very more nowadays. So there are a lot of effort to be done to achieve that. Nevertheless, it is important to keep trying.
At this point, I think it's important to perhaps to get the perspective from Mr. Stanley in terms of the work that you have done and how, on the ground, how is that relating to the report that World Bank has prepared?
Imagine yourselves living in a country such as Nepal. You're from a very poor country. Your family is very poor, you have 3 to 4 children, and you have no food on your table. Now you are forced to find a means to provide for your family, and appears an agent to your family and says that you will be earning something like 3,000 to 4,000 ringgit a month. I promise you a job in Malaysia, just trust me and follow me. And this poor guy has nothing in his hand. He just goes away pawning every single thing that he has, maybe his bicycle or his motorbike or the little land that he has, he sells off everything. He even goes and borrows a certain amount of money to pay for the sum of, for example, 10,000 ringgit Malaysian to come over to Malaysia and work. And he calculates it very well. He says 10,000 ringgit, I earn 4,000 ringgit a month, I can get back the money within 1 year and I'm done and I can settle my debts, I can provide for my family. Now upon arriving in Malaysia, at the airport, there the agent waits for him. As soon as he comes up from the airport, his passport is taken away, his contract is taken away, he's taken to a place, he's given a new contract, and he's forced to sign this new contract, and he's told, now this is your new contract, you're only going to earn 800 ringgit per month, we're going to cut this from the salary, end up peanuts in his hand. This is the exact situation that we, the NGOs in this country, are very afraid of in the bringing in of the 1.5 million Bangladeshi workers. Because currently this is the situation that is already happening to the millions of workers who are already in this country. They are facing a lot of issues in regards to labor law violations and human rights violations as well. So if our government cannot address these issues that are already happening back in this country, why is there a need to bring in more workers? Because that is only going to create the situation to become much more worse. And to tell you all frankly, I just released a statement, I think you read a statement last week. We NGOs are actually very overwhelmed with a number of cases, to an extent where we have to turn away certain cases. We have to differentiate between the less serious cases and the serious ones, because there's just too many cases on the table for us to handle, and we have to turn away many migrants and say, we don't have time for your case. That's the situation in Malaysia today. And here we have 1.5 million who is going to come in, you know. And we are asking, why do we need these 1.5 million workers in Malaysia when we already have nearly 2 million undocumented workers in Malaysia who are working in non-approved sectors? Many of these undocumented are working in non-approved sectors in Malaysia. Malaysia has only approved 5 sectors for working, or for migration work. So we have nearly 2 million. Why are not they being documented and sent to these correct sectors, number one? Number two, we have nearly over thousands of refugees in Malaysia who are not allowed to work. Why are they not being given permits and allowed to work to contribute to these sectors which are in demand of migrant labour? Number three, we also have foreign spouses, another sector of migrants in Malaysia, the foreign spouses who are not allowed to work. There are many of them who are expected to just live in Malaysia living without any income. So why do we need to source 1.5 million more workers when we have so many resources back in this country? Now, the only way I can understand this is number one, of course, the levy to nearly over 2 billion. This is the income of the government. And number two, as what Professor had put it in the morning, some companies, crony companies are involved. It's a large money making business for this country to bring in 1.5 million workers in the country. And we see that the trend is that businesses in Penang, in Malaysia, are now a kind of depending or aligning themselves toward foreign workers. Now, many employers will disagree, will say that no, hiring foreign workers is much more expensive, much more costly than hiring locals. But in a report just released by the UN Asia Pacific Migration Report, by the PMI, on the freeze of the 1.5 million workers. I just read this statement about 2 days ago. They were saying that the freeze of the 1.5 million workers will affect productivity because it affects cheap labor. The companies will not be able to source out for cheap labor. So in a way, they're admitting that, hey, migrants are cheap labor. You know, they are easy, they are cheap to be hired, and of course exploited as well. Because you can't go to a Malaysian worker and say you have to follow this, you have to work overtime, and you have to follow my rules and so on. Because Malaysian workers are smart. You have to give me my rights. Labor law is there. I have my rights. This is my pay and so on. But foreign workers are easily abused. You know, most of them are underpaid. Illegal deductions happen all the time. They can be controlled. Their passports are taken away. They're not allowed to go out. They're not allowed to fall in love. Not allowed to marry. Their whole life is controlled. So of course, some of the businesses will prefer having this kind of workers because they can exploit them, and of course productivity will improve in that sense. Because they are being exploited. That means productivity improves at the expense of the violations, labor violations and human rights violations of migrant labor. So this is what we are trying to bring up at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Stanley. I think this, you highlighted several issues. One is of course the abuses being done on the ground. And of course the second is like what YB Prof has highlighted in the morning, which is the strong vested interest within a certain group of business community, which has the interest of perpetuating this system. And of course, the third point that you've highlighted is that some of the local businesses, the business models here, are tuned towards using high-intensity labor, and of which a docile group of labor would be good. And of course, these are the three things that seems to be swirling around in terms of what's actually happening on the ground. Perhaps World Bank, perhaps Mr. Harry would be able to respond to it.
So one of the things that the report highlights is not only that it not only emphasizes that immigration to Malaysia has had positive impacts, but it emphasizes that there's a need to have a level playing field between foreign workers and local workers. So, you know, the situation in which foreign workers are being hired because they're able to be exploited, because employers are not following labor law, is not the kind of situation that ends up promoting the type of development that you want to see.
I'd just like to follow up on your point on the abuses and how this is a very important issue and one that unfortunately we see in a lot of countries in which we work on, and on which as an agency working on development, we try to think of potential solutions. And in talking very intensively with colleagues about this, one of the examples that we think about is the example of Korea, which is, we understand it's a very specific case, so there are some borders, some sea borders, so migration is more easily manageable. By the way, the model is exclusively GPGs, government. And the way you rule out all the potential for third-party savings. Now, if it was so easy to implement, I think that all the countries would have done it. I mean, I think that the sending countries have a lot of interest in protecting the rights of the workers. I think the receiving countries don't want people to be exploited. But I think that there is a lot of work to be done in improving the bilateral labor agreements and trying to rule out the third-party savings. So looking at Korea would be a starting point. But I think that the model will need to be Malaysianized in a way because it's not so easy to implement in this context.
Thank you. I think Mr. Quay raised also a point in terms of technology advancement. There have been lots of talk in terms of the possibility of technology displacing certain types of skills job, and to what extent is the immigration policy in Malaysia skewed towards not encouraging this type of immigration of skilled workers into the country, because the immigration, the foreign laborers that come to Malaysia tends to be of the lower skilled type. Any specific views and how this can be addressed?
It's a complicated question. I think a tough question. There's not a lot of good research on this in Malaysia and not even kind of globally. There are a couple of hints about what the impact of low-skilled labor might be on productivity. So some research from the United States suggests that actually low-skilled workers coming into firms end up allowing even lower-skilled native workers to specialize in certain types of tasks. That would be communicative type tasks, whereas foreign low-skilled labor tends to specialize in manual type tasks. So that is actually a productivity enhancing effect. The other thing that's more specific to Malaysia is that you've seen, as we talked about in the presentation, you've seen an increase in education levels among Malaysians. So there's actually an incentive that's created when foreign workers, low-skilled foreign workers, come into Malaysia for Malaysians themselves to invest in their education. So those are two bits of evidence that foreign labor isn't necessarily just substituting technological change and substituting for investments in capital.
If I can just follow up on the part of the high-skilled migration policies. So it's in a way when we talk about high-skilled people, which is not so much covered in this report, which is more on lower-skilled workers, we're talking in a way on part of the system which is a bit regulated by different incentives. So at some point of my presentation I was saying that it's important to keep in mind the incentives of the different players. In the case of high-skilled workers, also global talent, what really matters is also what this global talent wants to do. So in a way, highly skilled workers can decide, are very educated, can decide where to go. Because they make a lot of money, they go for exciting job opportunities, and so they have different markers that they can go to. So in this respect, what as a very important stress is the incentives you give to attract highly skilled foreign workers. And this is pretty much the same also with the diaspora. So in a way, I mean, it's a lot of countries look at Malaysia for the work on trying to attract diaspora back. So there are some steps that are important in this respect. Something that working with Talent Corp we have looked at is whether trying to give the incentive also to people that are directly from abroad would have a positive impact on attracting local talent. At the moment, the residence pass is only for people that are already in the country and then are allowed to have the residence pass to stay longer. Something that will make a difference and we see in general attracts talent is to give this opportunity to people that are not in Malaysia. So they will be attracted in the country and then they will get used. So this, I think it's, in a way, high-skilled migration policies are a different animal in a way. And in general, my main message would be try to understand more what global talent wants to get and see what is compatible with the objective of the market.
Thank you. I think Mr. Stanley just now highlighted a point in terms of that the business model of law, certain industries here are very much reliant on these cheap labor. So I want to pick on this point highlighted by Mr. Stanley and I pose the question to Mr. Hui. Being the audit partner of BDO, you have lots of clients and perhaps looking at the Penang, specifically on the Penang landscape, what do you get the feel? Is Penang, lots of businesses in Penang still relying on cheap labor, or is it a case of specific industries, or is it, what's the ground feel on this?
Yeah, basically, whether in Penang or in Malaysia, basically the business environment here is still very largely depend on several major factors which requires some large amount of low-skilled workers such as manufacturing, construction, plantation, agriculture, as well as services. So it is actually it's still inevitable to have large amount of low-skilled workers. We can, for the technology advancement, basically will help gradually by stages. So I think the environment still depends a lot on those skilled workers, especially we have a large amount of industrial estate. Yeah.
Thank you. There might be certain members of press in our audience, and in your presentation, you highlighted that a 10% net increase in immigrant labor would increase GDP growth by 1.1. So if this sort of statement is being picked up by the press and put on a headline, and if Malaysia wants to achieve another additional 2.2% GDP growth, you should then increase 20% of immigrant labor. So I'm sure it's not as simple as that. So perhaps at this point, you might want to add a caveat to this statement.
Okay, so yeah, no, it's not quite. So the results are based on the general equilibrium model, which is based on historical data, and is subject to a lot of assumptions. So I think that what the result wants to show is that if since the discussion was a lot about let's reduce the number of foreign workers, and this will solve all our problem, the economy will become a knowledge-based economy, and then Malaysia will become an income economy very fast. So I think that there's a resultant reaction to that, just to show that the Malaysian economy relies on foreign workers. The structure of the economy is such that there are a lot of labor-intensive sectors. Even if the country wants to move toward a more highly-skilled economy, still most of the jobs are in medium to low-skilled sectors. So in a way, if all of a sudden the migrant workers are out of the country, this would have a negative impact on the economy. So I guess that is our reading of the result.
Okay, so we get a full caveat to this statement. Perhaps at this point I want to open the floor for some Q&A, and then perhaps we will come back to the panel for this. Perhaps some questions from the floor, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Peter from UAG, Training Office for Human Development and the Pictures. I just wanted to ask a question on a member from the World Bank. Is it 10% increase in foreign workers increase 1.1% GDP? But what is the GNP, gross national product of Malaysia? And that's my first question. And the second question is, does the increase in foreign labor, what is the effect in our Malaysian foreign currency? Does it appreciate or depreciate? Is there any link? And also, that's the first question, the GNP. Thank you.
Okay, let me repeat the question. The first question from Peter was the 10% increase, net increase in immigrants is going to increase GDP by 1.1% based on the general equilibrium model. But what will be the impact on GNP? That's the first question. The second question is in terms of the remittance of capital and its impact on the ringgit.
So the answer to the question, to the first question, to be honest, is I don't remember. So I will need to go back to the study and have a look at it. So the precise impact on the GNP. Since the impact is positive on the GDP, I would expect it to go in the same direction. I don't know the exact amount. So on that, I can get back to you when I go back to the study. For the remittances, Harry was going to give a larger explanation, but just quickly, in general, there is, I think that the type of discussion that we heard in Malaysia is of two types. The first is about remittances seen as a receiving country, remittance receiving country. The one is about sending country. So as Malaysia as a receiving country, the amount of remittances is not in a very high range, so there is not so much concern about it. What I heard also is the discussion about the potential impact of outflow of remittances. And here we have a couple of experiences that we can share with you. Okay. Yeah. So it's in general what we're seeing in our client countries is that, especially in Gulf countries, there's been the idea of tax remittances. So the idea that migrants to the Gulf countries would be taxed if they send remittances back home. And this is really thinking about also the new sustainable development goal would be completely not in line with that. Now there is an effort towards reducing the cost of remittances, and that would be completely not in line with that. Another element of this is that taxing remittances probably will open a huge informal market for remittances. And we know that Malaysia Plan has been quite active in trying to reduce the informal market for remittances. So this is the experience we have with the discussion of remittances and exchange.
I would only add that the other countries, particularly the Gulf countries that have considered taxes on remittances, they're countries where remittances are orders of magnitude larger than those in Malaysia. In Malaysia, I think they're around 2 or 3% of GDP outflows of remittances. They're significantly higher in those countries that have considered those measures. And no one has, to our knowledge, no national government has implemented that type of measure.
I think talking about remittances or outflow, I think the amount of outflow will be normally compensated by the higher productivity due to the increase in productions, exports, and all this. I think this will be compensated as my view.
Thank you. I just want to also to add to it. We did a study on brain drain, and we also estimated the amount of remittances that might have left the country versus the amount of remittances into the country and it's quite for remittance into the country is normally either it's been invested or been consumed. So there is tax collection, GST collection implications thereon. Of course, the remittance out of the country, that's part of the quote-unquote doing business in terms of supporting the export earnings. Can we go on to the second question, please, from the floor?
My name is Jimmy. I also have running a factory in the past, which we employ about 100 over, foreign workers from Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepalese, For us, as a manufacturer, why we, the main reason why we employ these foreign workers is that they give us consistency in terms of our productivity and production. Because as a factory, what we need, is the attendance, of this worker, so that we are able. We try to employ the local workers and all things. They come 2 days, they disappear 3 days later, So partly it's also because of the wages, kind of thing. But we have been trying this kind of, we have this issue, I think, for past many years, so that's why I think you see so many of the factories and all things. We need to employ these foreign workers, to partly to have this consistency. The second things I'd like to highlight is the government's what we call consistency in terms of their regulations of bringing in these foreign workers. We have a lot of these government's policies, and especially on the immigration side, which is more on flip-flop policies. For example, they kind of give you policies that keep on changing. So when you want to kind of bring in the workers, today you have this sort of rules and regulation. When you submit, they say no, the rules have changed. So that creates a lot of issue for a lot of employers and also agents for renewals and to bring in the workers. And also currently, the governments are increasing the levy from 1,250 to 2,005 without giving any particular reason, for this. This would definitely have a big impact on the especially the industry who have relied on these migrant workers, for their production. The cost of the labor, will have a very bad impact on the industry itself. And we hope that the World Bank we like the ideas of bringing, the levy, being converted, bringing and use it, to kind of enhance the skill of our low-skill workers in Malaysia. I think the Malaysians are not really, the levies, a lot of them are actually go into somebody's pocket, Yeah. So that's what our idea. So, the levy has to be transparent, how much have been bringing in, how much have been used to enhance the the skilled workers of Malaysia. Like maybe the World Bank comment on that. Thank you.
I perfectly agree. I think this is fully in line with what we try to suggest in this report, which is really having a system that can get the inputs from the labor market, both for data analysis and for employers, understand what the skill shortages are, and adapt the levies accordingly. Now, this is part of the input to the levy system. We know that the country also has some economic objectives in terms of the productivity, in terms of the level of use of technology. But bringing all these elements into the levy system is something that an ideal management system would do. It's something that it's doable. We see that this is done in Singapore. There are all the shortcomings in the different management systems, but moving towards that model would be very helpful for the economy. Something that you also touched upon, and is I didn't stress it enough during the presentation, but we do more in the report, is the transparency and reliability of the process, and also having the process to be predictable by employers, so that investment decisions can be taken. And here, I think that again, Singapore is a very good example in which the announcement of the levy changes are done in advance, and there is a schedule even for 6 months based on the analysis done. So I think that that would be a system that of which Malaysia would benefit extensively.
Can I just comment on that? Because you brought up a very good point about productivity and relation to sustainability, in terms of working here and so on. But if we look at the situation, Malaysians who are not working here in our industries are doing the same kind of jobs in Singapore, plugging apples in Australia, collecting garbages in US and in UK. And the reason is because of the differences in the wages. So as well, last 2 weeks I came out with a statement to counter the 3 Ds with the 3 As. 3 Ds with 3 As. Number one, attractive salary. If we can have attractive salary for our locals here, then our locals will not go overseas to go and work in the same work that they're doing that they can do here. Of course, then how many Malaysians can actually survive with the minimum wage standard today? With the minimum wage today that they earn, I don't think so. Even a loan can be approved for them to purchase a house in Malaysia. You see, so they are forced to go overseas in that. Of course, then when we increase the minimum wage, there is this whole new debate about economic, the economic debate of the prices in cost of goods and production and so on. Number two, educate, rest and protection. Look at how these companies, for example, in construction sites, they are working these workers like cows all over the night, no rest that whole month. Some companies only give 1 month, 1 day rest. Some companies in the plantation sites, there's no such thing as off day or rest day for you. If you take leave, I cut your salary 30 ringgit. It's not I don't pay you, no, I cut your salary 30 ringgit if you take leave. That's how the situation is in plantations. So we're talking about educate rest. There needs to be educate rest. There needs to be given proper rest. More workers are needed to be hired in construction sites so that the workload of these workers will be reduced. Of course, then again, the cost goes up. A new debate comes on that aspect as well. And proper protection for these people. And number three, affirmation. In Malaysia, many of us view people who collect garbages or work in construction sites or doing plumbing work and so on as low standard or have no class. We need to change the perspective. We need to affirm these workers that they are equally important in our economy and that they contribute to the growth of Malaysia. So with these 3 A's, we can somewhat try to address this problem in Malaysia, workers being unproductivity and running away abroad to work in low-skilled workers. Because this is also another aspect of brain drain. Is we're talking about workers who are very educated. On this side, we have locals who are low-skilled, who are also living in the country for better wages outside in different countries.
Okay, actually, I want to add on to Stanley's point. We did the study on specifically on brain drain, taking into account the effect of exchange rates in the net, as well as local income taxes in different countries, and also controlling for the cost of living. On average, a high-skilled worker from Malaysia leaving Malaysia to go overseas, you get about 47,000 ringgit increase in your net income. So the lure of leaving Malaysia in terms of high-skilled labor is pretty strong. Okay, so perhaps we go on to a separate question. Yes, we have one at the back there. The gentleman with glasses, please.
So I had a question about the middle income trap as it relates to Malaysia. So I wonder if it's a bit short term to think about GDP increase instead. Because longer term, I mean, how does Malaysia it intends to change its GDP structure to be a bit more highly skilled rather than labor intensive? So at the moment, like if you're a company, what you do is you substitute local with migrant labor. That would give you immediately an increase in profits. Right? So in some ways, there's no incentive for you to upgrade. So I mean, longer term, how is this going to happen? You think of for Malaysia to get out of the middle income trap? If the companies don't have incentive and skilled labor is not conversion concept to foreign countries.
Thank you. I think you raised a very key point in terms of this whole issue of foreign labor is a multidimensional issue, as I highlighted as well. So it goes throughout the whole chain. Mr. Jimmy highlighted in terms of the need consistency in the production process, and of course that raises the first question: why is this consistency not achieved using capital equipment? Of course, equipment can be a little more consistent compared to labor, and of course the gentleman at the back raised the issue of middle income trap, in the sense that talent is leaving the shores, and hence who actually creates these types of capital equipment, and who trains up these technicians to be able to operate these types of equipment. So perhaps anyone on the panel would be able to add on and add to your perspective of this issue.
Yeah, so it's a difficult question. I mean, avoiding the middle income trap is I mean, there's a question about whether there's such a thing as the middle income trap, but then how to avoid it is a different question. I mean, I think I'll keep going back to this point about the educational levels of local Malaysians. I mean, I think that's one indication that that it's not necessarily the case that that the presence of cheaper foreign labor is going to hinder development out of being a middle income country. Yeah, I mean, and I would only cite the other evidence before that again, the presence of low-skilled labor can actually have kind of competitiveness inducing effects where you have a superior specialization of labor into different types of tasks.
Yeah, so, and then with respect to the middle income trap and the model of a country which is more based on cheap labor. So, first of all, I think that based on the international evidence, we don't see so much of this impact. So we're aware that there is a lot of discussion in Malaysia about the presence of foreign labor to retard technological upgrade. We are not able to do this analysis here because we don't have the available data. But when we look at Thailand, for example, or in the US, we don't see this impact. I guess this is the first part of the answer. So let's assume that there is this impact, even if we don't have evidence. Now, what the reality of the fact is that in Malaysia there are a lot of labor-intensive sectors. The plantation sector is very important, and it's hard from today to tomorrow to just rely on capital and not have labor. So this is the reason why a sequential approach in which the system is more market-based would be important to move towards a more technology-based economy. How to do that? It's again the point about using levies. So levies can be used since we don't want to have workers not have enough labor to produce, because that would be negative for the economy. We'll have a negative GDP, we'll have negative GDP growth. So the potential way to go is to use levies that are a price restriction and a way raise revenues. So you don't stop employers from producing, you don't stop the production process, but at the same time they need to pay the levies. At the same time, we use these levies to provide incentive for technological upgrade and also to train the Malaysian workforce. And in that way, sequencing the action in this way, it's possible to move towards a more technological-based economy, and also to try to avoid the middle income trap.
Thank you. Do we have another question at the back? Yeah? Mr. Yo, please.
Two questions here. Number one is that I think when we have to realize that in the US, EU, and the UK now, there are legislations now looking at how labor, human rights on labor is been impacted, and they have passed regulations such that those companies down the supply chains who are involved in abusive practices could be sanctioned off the supply chain. Now I wonder how many companies, small, medium enterprise or whatever, are aware of this, that they can be taken off the chain if they are found abusive, at least in relation to the EU, US and the UK. And the second question is this. Now if you look, even take a cursory observation of the capital market, many of the listed corporations are the ones, whether in development, property development, whether in manufacturing or whatever, they are the one making the billions. They are the one probably employing most of the immigrant labor. The question is, why is it not possible for them to have an enhanced, better wages or whatever it is to attract locals rather than relying on foreign? Is it because they have to continue to report higher profits in order to protect the share valuation? Thank you.
I'll just talk about his first question because it was quite relevant, especially in the report by the World Bank, where it emphasized on more enforcement to cover these issues. Malaysia currently lacks this part, enforcement, and that's why we have many labour violations and human rights violations happening in regards to migrant workers. Now it's much more easier for us to deal with multi-level MNC companies because they live up to international standards, and it's quite easier to make them answer to their violations. For example, when you had the case against Nike and so on, it became a world issue and their reputation was at stake. But it's quite difficult to handle the small companies, which does not have international standing and so on. They are the because they don't worry about this international standing. Tomorrow they might just close down the business and open a new business. So this part lacks in Malaysia. Enforcement, we need to emphasize, we need to work on that part of enforcing. There's so many, you see, Malaysia is this is the problem with Malaysia. We have so many good laws in Malaysia, but the problem is we don't enforce those laws. That's why we have all these problems today. So if our government starts to look seriously into it and start enforcing these laws on employers, then I think to some extent this problem of abuses could be addressed. Because we have many beautiful laws already in place in our country that protects the rights of migrant workers. But most of the time we see only migrant workers, as you put it rightly in the report, migrant workers that are often being criminalized or charged in court. Very few employers are actually charged in court. Only maybe high-profile cases such as murder cases and so on, they are charged in court. But the small cases, for example, violations of salary, labor violations, or if you lock them up in forced labor and so on, they're not charged. So this, in a way, gives an idea to local businesses that hey, we can do this and you don't get caught, so no problem, the outrage doesn't go. But hey, discourages this whole prospect. Second question, I'll let it to you.
I completely agree on your first point, and just to add to that is about how feasible it is to enforce enforcement. So in a way, it's we're looking at the ILO standards and how many sectors are usually considered sufficient for given the labor force. I mean, and Malaysia is way below than that. But staffing in a way that all the market is covered and there is constant enforcement is also a tough job, and we recognize that. So I mean, I guess my point would be back on how to have an enforcement and leverage on the technological system in the country. So all the IT systems, and also on some tools that can help understanding what are the areas at more risk and target that. So I think it's, in a way, I agree with you on enforcement being a bit lacking, but at the same time, I think that it's one of the reasons that enforcement is a bit lacking is that it's also hard to ensure complete enforcement. And this is true across the world. Having a 100% compliance is difficult. So how to think of potential ways to catch the cases that are more likely to happen. The second question, it was about capital markets and the firm in the capital markets and using the foreign labor, right? And I think
it's more of why are these listed companies who make lots of profits, why are they not offering higher wages to the employees, to the local employees?
So, answering as an economist, I would say why they should if they can have cheap labor. So, in a way, if whenever there are inputs that are available at a certain price, it's very hard to expect the firm would continuously pay a higher price. So in a way, this is where government intervention is needed, and if there is the feeling that the cost is too low, and also for unfair competition, because as you mentioned, there is these workers work long hours, the labor standards are not respected, then in the case the first move would be making sure that the labor standards are respected. And then if the cost undercut Malaysian workers, this could be compensated by the levies. But I wouldn't think that the responsibility on paying the higher wages should be on the company. This is the type of case in which the government intervention would be needed if it's believed that this is not in line with the objective of the government.
Yeah, Mr. Quay, perhaps you have something.
Yeah, okay. In this area, dealing with capital markets, basically we are dealing with quite a number of public listed companies. Actually, not all as you think. Profitability of public listed company is actually not every companies are making very high profits, and although some of them are depending on which industry they are in, and also in consideration of whether using local or foreign workers, profitability is not an issue for consideration. Basically, like what Mr. Jim Yong said, he's basically in a manufacturing environment. Consistency is one of the very main factor whereby you need to meet your customer deadlines, and there are a lot of issues to be considered other than just the remuneration package. Furthermore, I believe the amount of remuneration paid to foreign workers compared to local, actually, if I'm not wrong, is not really that cheap if you package everything in. But the more important thing is the consistency and efficiency, and those things are very, very important to meet their customers' timeline. This is one of the very major considerations. That's what we basically our clients are experiencing.
Okay, I think perhaps I also want to add on to it, which is that the non-compliance with certain labor standards, I think within TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, is fairly clear that businesses in signatory countries such as Malaysia has to be compliant with International Labour Organization standards. So sooner or later, things have to improve one way or another. And in terms of the why can't companies pay more to their local employees? To some extent, some of the listed companies are not really that competitive. If you look in terms of the international spectrum, some of these companies are actually not making a high return on the capital, on the assets, and as such, they are really not really making the right amount of return. Okay, maybe we should continue with the next, another question from the floor, please. Yes, please.
One important thing to note about the relationship of foreign workers to labor force participation rates is actually there's some evidence that the presence of foreign workers can help increase local female labor force participation in particular, which kind of the is rather low in Malaysia. It's been improving, but it's rather low compared to other countries in the region. So there's some evidence that low-skilled foreign workers come to Malaysia, they work in the domestic sector, and they actually allow higher-skilled Malaysian women to work at higher rates than previously.
I think what she brought up was a very good point. The way most of Western companies are now changing their trend of workers and so on. But I don't think so that applies to industries such as the plantation industry or even the manufacturing industry. They can't take back a coconut to cut at home and so on. But I think the point is that the working environment needs to be positive. The way employers treat their workers, the incentives that they give to their workers, the social benefits that the workers get, these are the things that motivate our local workers to be attached to the company. And touching on the point of the foreign workers which can contribute in having our women to join the workforce, that on the human rights perspective also creates a lot of social problems, because I was going through a report yesterday and so on. Because when we say we bring in women workers from other countries, for example, from the Philippines to come into Malaysia and substitute our workers here, our home here, so that our women can go to work, that creates a whole set of social problems in the sending countries. You see, in Malaysia, we are an NGO that advocates for the rights of migrants. We help them in terms of their problems. They face labor violations and human rights violations. But there in the Philippines, there are NGOs that are set up to look into the problems faced by husbands. Because many of these female workers that leave their family and goes overboard and work, what happens to the families? The family collapses. The children is deprived of the care of their mothers. So this creates a whole new lots of social problems within the family. There are husbands who have had extramarital affairs. There are husbands who have divorced their wives, gone into drug addiction, the family has broken down. So this is a total new problem that is being created in the sending countries. So I don't think so that can be a solution. A solution for Malaysia, yes, but overall as we look at it in the universe, it cannot be a solution, because on the other hand, it's creating problems in the sending countries. See, so that's why.
So, and recognizing that all those impacts are real, there are benefits in sending countries as well. Certainly, remittances have a large impact. There can be reductions in child labor because of those reductions. I think there's a little bit of debate about the evidence, but just to highlight that there are, on the other side, some potential benefits in the sending countries as well.
Yes, sir, please, your question.
The name is K.F. Chan. We hear of abuses, poor treatment of workers, foreign workers, and also non-contribution from the employer's standpoint of these workers to their operations. Now, these workers come from multiple countries, okay, not just from one specific country or single country. So it is like a global issue. So, am I right to say that maybe we should look at this problem globally, macroscopically, okay? I understand that Malaysia have signed agreements with groupings like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This has focused on the productivity, the development of Malaysia in particular, okay? And Malaysia is a member of these two groupings. Now, can Malaysia or can somebody use these two platforms, to address the issues that we are talking about today and that we are experiencing? I'm sure it's not just in Malaysia, but other countries as well. Thank you.
On the Trans-Pacific Agreement, as a human rights defender, of course, I'm very happy if the government were to sign the TPPA, because then it creates a new arena, a space for us to hold the government accountable in terms of enforcement, and also companies accountable. I do not know what the mechanism is, because it's still unclear how the mechanism is going to be, but I presume that it's something like how the EU operates, where a country has violations, they can take the case up to the EU courts and hold the companies or hold the government accountable. But as a Malaysian, of course, I'm not favoring the TPPA, because it has a lot of its effect as well towards us Malaysians.
one potential opportunity is that hasn't been taken advantage of yet is the formation of the ASEAN Economic Community. So right now it deals specifically with high-skilled labor, but I think there's some opportunity to in the future begin thinking about lower or mid-skilled labor in ASEAN countries and creating labor standards for the movement of individuals around the region.
But again, we look at ASEAN countries. Who are these ASEAN countries? Who are these ASEAN leaders? Thailand, Indonesia, Myanmar. People who have very bad human rights records. Leaders who have bad human rights records, who are also in the same process like Malaysia, abusing the citizens and violations of human rights. And do we think we can trust these leaders with protection standards? And even with the arrangement of ASEAN that, I don't enter into your country boundaries, I don't interfere in your country matters, you don't interfere in my country matters. These are the type of understanding that ASEAN leaders have. We have come out, civil society movement have come out with various declarations, with various recommendations to ASEAN, but there's no point because the leaders are not acting on those recommendations. And they don't talk about all this. They feel insecure when they talk about all this. You don't touch about what I do in my country, and I don't touch about what you do in your country. If we have this kind of attitude, then no point of ASEAN or whatever conferences that you're going to have, because it's not going to work in any way, it's going to be helpful in any way.
All right. Do we have another question from the floor? No? Okay, so maybe I should chip in at this point. The Malaysian Economic Monitor, it is a wide-ranging report, and the immigration policy is just one of many. And I think in the report you highlighted the outlook as well as the future outlook for Malaysia. From there, perhaps you might want to raise one or two points that to share with us.
To be completely honest, the Malaysian Economic Monitor is the result of a wide team, and the team specialized on that particular team based in Kuala Lumpur. So I would prefer to have our country economist Rafael to come and talk about that, because they have been focusing on that part and more.
Okay, so in which case then, perhaps we should delve into this specific report in a much more detailed manner. One of the points that you highlighted is the high-skilled expats within Malaysia earn a lot more compared to the local Malaysian high-skilled labor. In which case, why do you think there is a strong incentive for high-skilled foreign labor to come to Malaysia? Is it because of the skills gap that is existing in this country, or is it some specialist reason? Any specific reason behind this case?
I'll mention a couple of things and then Mauro can mention a few more. So, I mean, one, I would say that there's a global market for talent at that level. So there's a global market that sets a price for people who have very, very specialized skills. And those are the kinds of people who earn these higher premium.
So then naturally leads on to why are the local Malaysian high-skilled labor not within that category?
So I think it's the part of the analysis focus on that is really restricted to the occupations that are managerial occupations. So when we talk about managers, what we're looking at is really the CEO of international organization. And that part, if you think about the CEO of Nestle or this type of international organization, usually across the world, is not only common in Malaysia, is that these people are usually the gray eye part of the workforce. So I don't think it's, my reading of the result is not that Malaysia don't make enough. It's not that the premium for Malaysian is low, it's just that that is a characteristic of those specific occupations. So in general, when you have a high-skilled workforce in a country which attracts a lot of multinationals for them is what we usually have. So I wouldn't interpret this result as saying that Malaysia will make much drastic Malaysian difference.
And within the report, is there any differentiation between the local businesses versus the multinational businesses in terms of the employment policy and hence the impact on the immigration policy and the use of foreign labor?
So the report is based on labor for survey data, and we don't have information on the type of the firm. That is something that could be done using demand level data, so from the firms, but unfortunately we don't have this.
All right, okay. Do we have another question from the floor? No? Okay. Perhaps this would be a very good point in time to end the forum. I would like to, of course, take the opportunity to thank our guests from the World Bank, as well as our fellow panelists, Mr. Quay as well as Mr. Stanley, and of course everyone's participation on this Saturday morning. We thank you all. We will be having another event at a later stage on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and at that point, stay in touch and drop us your email, and we'll send you the notification at that point. So please join hands and thank our panelists as well. At this point, I'll return it. I'll give it back to Jess.